Um, Today we're going to talk about the difference between America and what the term heathen means. Um, and this is how we're going to set ourselves apart from what people refer to as shithole countries. This is a term that Trump had used um, years ago, when like within a few years ago, he had mentioned certain places being called shithole countries because he referred to them as being shitty because they had no money. Now, the story of a heathen um, is basically like now a writer named Catherine Joyce had wrote this, um, or Professor Catherine Jin Lum. She basically the story of the heathen. This is written from a Stanford religious studies professor Catherine Jin Lum had wrote in her book. She had wrote a book called Heathen, um, Religion and Race in American History, and it's all a familiar one for anybody who has studied this concept. It's a story about how Americans have set themselves apart from a world of sufferers as a superior people and a humanitarian people, a people who deserve the good fortune that they have received, and they have a responsibility to spread it to others. The necessary center um, of that story is how the idea of a heathen, whether in its historical sense of people holding the wrong religion, or its contemporary incarnation as a pitiable third world other, but always a figure in need of transformation and salvation, under the supposedly beneficent mission of offering that salvation. Jin Lum writes the concept has served as a wide-ranging, get out of jail free ticket that renders any harm excusable if done in the name of eradicating any wrong religion. Now, Heathen is a story about religion, but also about race, colonialism, empire, and identity, and it's particularly the American identity. The concept of heathenism was used to rationalize the slaughter of indigenous people, the burning of witches, the enslavement of African Americans, the exclusion of Chinese immigrants, the abduction of Native American children, and the usurpation of U.S. territories and colonies right down to the self-rule. But in some ways, Jin Lum notes the idea of heathenism is a large part of the origin story of the American concept of race. It's merely what we call an historical notion. Or actually, it's not, basically. So it's not really a historical notion either. But because the word heathen fell into a disrepute, it does not mean that the mental maps through which Americans envisioned the heathen world similarly disappeared. Now, Jin Lum writes, it's there still in the softer language that Christian missionaries use today. This is why I'm a fucking atheist, because I cannot stand the Christian shit. And now, as the corresponding secular discourse wherein the poor and needy heathen has been reborn as the starving child living in the third world, it was certainly there back in early 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic was blamed slightly on the modernized accusations of heathen practices in China. The notion of the heathen hasn't always been fixed or universal. Um, Abolitionists and people under the colonial rule have often turned the term back on itself, pointing out that American saviors have long been enthralled to idols of their own. Now, heathenism is also one of America's most enduring foils, shoring up the country's fragile sense of who we are. The heathen world is precisely this. It's an elastic realm of individualist others who will reflect back to Americans, as in a funhouse mirror, the selves that they wish to deny. Um, um, Pity, control, or romance, writes Jin Lum. As long as Americans are not the interchangeable child starving overseas, as long as they are the ones putting money in the offering plates for the poor heathens in Africa or Asia, they themselves are the ones that are fucking blessed. Jin Lum had spoke with Salon about this back in June. Now, she was asked about what inspired her book. Now, basically, she did say that from a personal and an academic story. Well, there's both a personal and academic story to where their book came from. Now, from a personal standpoint, um, Jen Lum is the daughter of a Chinese immigrant, and she grew up in a conservative religious tradition, with the belief that people from China who did not receive the gospel were heathens. So she grew up believing that if she hadn't been so lucky to be born in the U.S. to a Christian family, she would have been a heathen in China and bound for fucking hell. She basically wrote her first book about hell. So you could say that she's been grappling with questions about hell and heathen for a long time, and she wrote in the book that as a child, she could it could have been a she could have been a primary source for herself as a historian now, but as an adult, um, she can be a primary source for herself again because the people that she writes about are trying to grapple with these things continually, as she still is. So I guess you could say that this book is an attempt of an historian to understand herself and the people understood to be heathens in the history of this country. Now, if you're going to look at it at an academic standpoint, she was writing an undergrad thesis 20-something years ago on an admission to Gold Rush era California, and looking at missionaries to the Chinese immigrant population and to the Euro-American population. She was struck by how much the Chinese were consistently referred to as heathens. Then it came across this 19th century mission map of the world, the missionary map of the world that color-coded the world by religion, and was struck by how much of the world was colored gray for heathen. And on one hand, it's this term applied to the Chinese population, but on the other hand, it incorporates the vast majority of the world. I was really interested in what it was about the category that is so capacious and also so politically useful. Now, with the word heathen, is there a way to define this term given how widely it's been used to paint so many different places and people from different countries? The term heathen is the rough Germanic translation of the term pagan. It originates as a description of people in an ancient Greco-Roman past who failed to accept Christianity as a religion. It refers to the people wandering in the heath, understood to be on the outskirts of the society, continuing to worship Thor, Odin, and the old gods. Then that term takes on a much wider use as Europeans and Euro-Americans, and it begins to realize that there are many other people in the world who hold many different kinds of beliefs and religion. Now, often the term refers to people who hold wrong religion. But as we tried to show in the book, wrong religion manifests in many different ways, so the heathen comes to incorporate people who supposedly don't know how to take care of their bodies, and they don't know how to take care of their land, but they don't have any progressive history, so to speak. So it incorporates much more than just interior beliefs. So, basically, people opened the book by citing a recent history that invoked heathenism and the necessity of converting heathens as a seeming justification for the deaths of the First Nations people in Canada who were removed to residential schools meant to assimilate them. Now, the story came out a year ago with the discovery of Indigenous children's graves in Canada. Now, this is a troubling article from any perspective as a way of almost justifying the deaths. The author actually says that whatever sacrifices were exacted in pursuit of that grace, including the extinction of a noble pagan culture, is worth it. That's what I call the get-out-of-jail-free card, the use of this concept of saving the heathen to excuse all manner of atrocities. The residential school system was justified as a means of Christianizing heathen children. So enslavement was justified as a means of Christianizing the supposed heathens of Africa. Now, this heathen ticket has been a very effective rationalization, as many colleagues can put it, of blessing the brutalities Americans have engaged in the name of helping other people. Now, I've always wondered, how does heathenism play into a Christian nationalism? Now, the question of that is what is America and who gets to be an American is at the heart of what part 2 of the book about the body politic. The question here is whether America is a Christian nation, and should we be allowing heathen people into the body politic? Now, this is really the question around Chinese exclusion. in the late 19th century, and it raised a lot of the same issues that come up today around the anxieties of the white Christian nationalists about this nation, and who can belong to it. Now, the term heathen was one of the most common derogatory terms applied to the Chinese people in the late 19th century. A lot of scholarship on Chinese exclusion focuses on reasons for exclusion that concern the labor competition and economics. Now, this is important, just as it is today. It remains extremely important in conversations around replacement theory, for instance, but the rationalizations that religion offers to justify these economic claims are crucial. In the late 19th century, There were Christians saying that America is and needs to remain a Christian nation, and allowing the immigration of heathens into this nation had threatened the bedrock of who we are. So we're supposed to be an example for the rest of the world of what Christian nationalization and what Christian civilization should look like. The fact that they're so worried about the immigration of heathens reveals how unstable the foundations are of this supposed city on a hill. They're actually worried that Christians are going to be converted to heathenism faster than supposed heathens can convert to Christianity. So for me, it reveals how tenuous this identity of white Christian nationalism is. Now, the word heathen has been adapted over the years to apply to many different cultural groups, like Native Americans, the enslaved African American people, Chinese immigrants, subjects of missionary work in other countries, and even later waves of European immigrants to the U.S. Oftentimes, when we think about race, we think about it in terms of a hierarchy, based on supposed physical differences that are obviously socially constructed, but which try to distinguish between groups. The thing about the word heathen is that it collapses in the racial hierarchies. It collapses everyone below the white Christian colonizer into one category. That is a racial process too, and Kim the girl basically she's working. Hold on a second here. Yeah, Catherine Jin Lum was basically working with somebody. Oh, hold on here. Yeah, so basically, Catherine Jin Lum was working on a book with somebody here. Let me see who the person was. Okay, yeah, she was working with Sylvester Johnson in his book that he was writing called African American Religions. So he argues that race is a process of separating the European from the non-European, the colonizer from the colonized, and the governor from the governed. The heathen is essential to that process of separation. It's so often that when we think about race, it's socially constructed. It's understood as an inherent quality that cannot be changed. The heathen is a changeable figure. The heathen can be converted. The heathen can become the Christian. So some scholars have seen it as not a racial category. I think that the changeability of the heathen is exactly what makes it so powerful in the separation of the world into these binaries of European, non-European, and governor governed. Um, Again, it's that get out of jail free ticket. The notion that people can be changed to be something else rationalizes the European and the Euro American interventions in broad regions of the world under the heading of saving heathens. We don't use the term heathen much anymore, but that doesn't mean that the ideas underlying this binary view of the world have disappeared. They've just become subsumed under the language of this world, of a third world, developing nations, or in religious contexts of frontier people, or unreached peoples. Getting into the more modern, polite versions of this, it is fair to say that the concept of heathenism has basically been used as justification for empire or subjugation. We can certainly say that the term has been used for that, but I don't want to discount the motivations of missionaries, the volunteers, and the humanitarians who believe that they're helping people and in some cases are. I don't want to just boil it down to justification for empire. I don't think everybody is using the concept of the heathen and what it's doing that and with their mind. But as we said before, the idea of bringing salvation blesses brutalities. So even if that's not the motivation, it has the effect. People have wrote about how both the language and the general approach of missionary work has changed over the past century. Now, it does change and it doesn't. There have been increasing challenges to the concept of the heathen by the late 19th and early 20th century. Back in the 1930s, some mission organizations basically abandoned the term and said that the point of mission was not to convert people or save souls, but it was to help the human condition, help the human condition people are living in. So basically, it was to help the human conditions that people are living in. But there still are mission There still are mission organizations that continue to see the world in this framework of unreached peoples, and some of the language completely parallels that is used in the 19th century, even if the term heathen hasn't been used. Ah, shit. Now, basically, there have also been talks about how these ideals show up today in discussing developing nations and the white saviorism. To go back to the question about whether this is just a way of justifying an empire, I would make an analogy to the ways that we think about racism and the difference between critical race theory. And it basically understands racism as embedded in systems and the ways that people who push back against CRT think that you can't be racist if you don't intend to be. There are people who say or believe that they're not doing harmful things, but helpful things, but at the same time they're constructing long-lived systems that have divided the world into this stark us versus them type of thing. The white savior and everyone else, and these systems remain even if the motivations are positive. Basically, Catherine Jin Lung wrote in the book about the third world or developing nations as euphemisms for this figure of the heathen. If you look back at the religion in the secular realm, she lives in Silicon Valley, so she's very exposed to Silicon Valley tech saviorism, um, which we see as very connected to this rhetoric. Even though those people would be horrified to hear that, the idea that you can do good for others while also helping yourself traces back to this dynamic in the 19th century that going out and saving the heathen is a way of ensuring your own salvation. Now, in this secularized understanding of it, Silicon Valley is all about doing good and lining your pockets at the same time. Within the tech salvationism, and it continues to be the stark binary between people who have technology and they can change the world and those who are the receivers of that. And it also traces back to many assumptions that have been attracted and attached to this figure of the heathen. Um, there's also been writings about how the language of the heathen countries has been replaced by Donald Trump's talk as he referred to them as shithole countries. If you Google Trump's language around shithole countries, you will find maps that show America and Northern Europe as the only parts of the world that are not shitholes, and you can see that in some part of the media and social media coverage around the war in Ukraine. Particularly at the beginning of that crisis, a lot of the coverage was shocked because Ukraine is in part of the world that is not supposed to be the heathen world, or the third world, or the shithole country. It's supposed to be in Europe, so people were explicitly saying things like, "It's shocking to see this happening here." So to people with blonde hair and blue eyes in a civilized country, it wasn't supposed to happen in a civilized country. It's supposed to happen elsewhere. Back in 2019, the Vatican had hosted a synod for people from the Amazon region of South America. It sparked a fierce backlash from the right-wing Catholics who used virulently anti-indigenous language to condemn an effort by the church to be more inconclusive. Now, we've seen things like that show up corners of the Christianity embracing old-school heathen language. Now, not many corners of Christianity use the heathen terminology out loud, but even if they don't, this idea that salvation is in Christ alone provides the stakes for missionary work. It's a way of demarcating. Not sure if I'm saying that word right. It's the boundary of what it means to be Christian and what is outside of that. That's really what the concept of the heathen is about. What is the not Christian like? What does that identity entail? Now, to blur that boundary and to say that we're going to bring other traditions into that conversation, it traces back to what I was saying about Chinese exclusion. It strikes at the heart of these anxieties about who are we? What is the border of our identity? What's the difference between the us and them? And that's where you see this language emerge. Now, it's really important in this debate, in the debate over becoming more respectful of other traditions, to look at Christians from communities that were historically deemed heathen. In a global Christianity, people from the heathen world who adopted Christianity have done so with extremely clear eyes. They're not people who are just cooped and colonized. They are people who see the hypocrisy that white Christians have often brought, and they have provided alternatives. So the question of what it means to respect another culture or tradition and to put Christianity into conversation with other traditions, they live that out on the daily, and they are much less interested in the border policing than white Christian nationalists get all up in arms about the who and the them are. Now, I've always wondered, does this ideal show up in debates about how the U.S. grapples with our history and our racial history in particular? Now, a lot of this story is about people who think that they're doing really good things. I think that it's analogous to how people push back against CRT by saying we're not racist, but we don't have bad motivations. But then they fail to see the systems that they have created and that they participate in, which uphold witnesses as the whiteness is superior. Now, you can believe that you're not doing something harmful while also benefiting from and perpetuating systems that are doing harm. We think this no. Sorry. I think that the story that we're trying to tell here helps to explain that by bringing religion into the conversation, because one of the most powerful things about religion is the way that it blesses things that are really fucking ugly. Religion can provide language to make things look good, even if it doesn't. You can see that with American exceptionalism, America is exceptionally violent. It's exceptionally racist. So how can white Christian nationalists claim that it's exceptionally good? A city on a hill. It's the power of religion that does that. Basically, Catherine Jin Long was finishing the book as the pandemic was hitting, and originally wasn't planning to write anything about it, but I couldn't ignore she couldn't ignore how much about what was written about but seemed to be everywhere, particularly as someone who's particularly she's Asian American. The term Wuhan flu and the anti-Asian violence, the anti-Chinese hate just paralyzed. Basically, it paralleled so much of what we see in the history. In one of the articles she writes in the postscript, the author she wrote something to the effect that the Chinese wet markets must go, and it sounds like as a direct echo of Dennis Kearney, who was an anti-Chinese demagogue in the late 19th century, whose famous refrain was "The Chinese must go." That refrain from Chinese exclusion was used again in 2020 to scapegoat the Chinese as being responsible for creating the pandemic because they're backward, they have dirty eating habits, and they believe in magical practices connected to food. Now, all of this was blamed for starting the virus and spreading it to the world. At the same time, she also saw a really interesting way in which America was held up to what we call the heathen barometer. Basically, it was explained as a way to identify heathenism in the world and to call out things that appear to be heathen at the heart of America itself. With the COVID pandemic, we saw what I call a third world barometer, where people were completely shocked that there wasn't enough PPE, there wasn't enough hand sanitizer. People were saying, it isn't supposed to be like this, America isn't a third world country, and why are we acting like one? For me, that was this long story manifesting again in really stark ways. When it comes to the book, we come to this powerful conclusion. The concept of the heathen as either scary or pitiable is used to make Americans feel blessed by comparison. It's almost like a deflection. It's the same thing that we were talking about with Ukraine. This isn't supposed to happen here, but then moments like the pandemic expose that. I think that's where the heathen barometer has been so powerful as a way of showing. Actually, this has always been the case. America has always had its own idols, whether that's the idolatry of guns, of money, of white supremacy. And these are things that people have called out to criticize the hypocrisy of Americans, claiming that no, this just happens in the heathen world. In the 19th century, Frederick Douglass drew on the heathen barometer to say, how can we send foreign missionaries overseas to save the so-called heathen when white Americans are bowing at the altar of King Cotton? It rips the veneer of white American exceptionalism, and it shows that this is happening here. Is the ideal of true religion versus heathenness a missing piece in the complex of what we're saying, of what we're having over history? A lot of scholars have looked at the relationship between religion and race, so I don't know what's missing. Though maybe it hasn't been described in this way, but I think once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. Maybe that can contribute to conversations about whether we go from here. I'm a historian. I'm not a theologian. Um, or an ethicist. But there is a question I often get when I talk about this work. What are we supposed to do? I can't give you fucking answers for that. I just want to tell the story of what I've seen people doing, but I hope it causes people to think about it for themselves, because I understand that this as a human doing something with religious truth claims. I think humans can change that too, and this is not a story that can be changed forever, basically. So, if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just a little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.